They slowed their cars when passing the hollowed curve of Miller's Glen Road, not for the crumbling farmhouse tucked back behind a leaning oak, but for what sat just beyond its gravel drive. A dog, old, gold, and still as a scarecrow, his back straight, hind legs folded neatly beneath him, tail curled like a comma in the cold dust. Always facing the road, always waiting. Taught to some, it looked like a scene carved out of Hobbiton, old retriever sticking to some long-forgotten rhythm that time had neglected to unteach. To others, it was something stranger, because he was always there. Every morning, rain, wind, fog that turned the trees into ghosts. Even after the house grew dark and the second-story windows were boarded, even after the newspaper stopped coming, he would rise from the porch as the first lights softened the hills, walk the same 40 paces, sit just so, wait. The mailman noticed first, then the school bus kids, then the joggers where the road dipped near Widow's Bridge. No one ever saw him wander, no one ever saw him chase. Only watch. They said he looked more like a sentry than a pet. Not broken, not lost, focused, and that made it worse, because everyone knew. You don't wait like that unless someone promised to come back. This is the story of the dog at the end of the driveway, of the family who once lived in the faded farmhouse. Of a morning ritual known only to one couple, one dog, and perhaps the wind of a promise made gently and never truly undone. Even after 3 winters, he still faced the same lane, at the same hour, with the same slow, steady breath, as if he knew something no one else did, as if he remembered. At the back of the kitchen, just before the sun cleared the ridge beyond Miller's Glen, Ed Dwyer would run one weather-worn hand across the stove's brass handle, feeling for warmth. Kettle first, then the teaspoon, 2 cups, always 2. He moved with the quiet care of a man who'd done these steps long enough to feel their weight change. A drawer closed gently. A cabinet's hinge gave its soft groan. In the soft light, he'd lift her cardigan pale blue, sleeves patched at the elbows, and drape it over the back of her chair. Outside, the porch boards creaked beneath steady paws. Chester had risen with the kettle's hiss, same as every day, old bones, softer now, but still strong. He stretched once, slow and long, tail offering a wag that stirred the frost-cold air. Then he made his descent, 5 steps down, then around the flower-bed stones, now covered in fallen leaves. He walked with the same quiet reverence as Ed inside each, paw placed like he knew whose eyes watched from the window, 40 paces to the drive's edge. There, at the corner of the red-painted mailbox, the paper waited, rolled tight, rubber, already beaded with dew. He picked it up gently, teeth finding the same grip as yesterday and 1,000 yesterdays before. That the walk back was unhurried, dignified, almost ceremonial, as if the valley itself held its breath for the moment the golden dog would return. By the time Chester pushed the kitchen door open with his nose, Ed was pouring the tea, 2 mugs steeping, no sugar, just the scent of lemon balm rising in patient spirals. Chester patted across the worn tile floor, the newspaper held like a gift. He paused at the table where Marianne sat in her robe, slippers soft against the chair leg. "Well, there's my good boy," she would say, reaching to take the paper from his mouth. He'd wait, he always waited, till her hands wrapped soundly around it before letting go. Then he'd sit just beside her, not begging, not watching for crumbs, simply being near. This happened every morning. In the fall, when the wind carried smells of wood smoke and far-off apples, In spring, when the porch dripped from last night's rain, even in the brittle months of January, when Chester's paws sometimes paused mid-step, testing the porch's ice-blown boards, still waiting. Even on days like this, Ed would chuckle, ruffling his ears. Chester's tail might thump once in reply, but his eyes, those gentle, ageless eyes, would never leave Marianne until she was fully settled. Cardigan pulled snug around her shoulders. Sometimes she'd read the headlines aloud. Sometimes she wouldn't. Sometimes she'd just hold the paper in her lap like a bird that might fly if startled. Chester didn't mind. To him, the delivery wasn't about the news. It was the giving, the carrying of something from the edge of the world back to her hands. To fetch was instinct. To deliver was devotion. Over time, their mornings unfolded in such polished rhythm. It felt more like ceremony than routine. Something sacred, even if unspoken. Later, when Marianne would nap near the hearth, or Ed would step down to the orchard for pruning, Chester would settle by the doorway back to the fire, eyes on the lane, not dozing, not wandering, just waiting. Because the morning wasn't marked by the kettle's boil, or the sun rising past Miller's Ridge. It was marked by that brief exchange newspaper from mouth to hand, her smile meeting his steady gaze, then the soundless promise that tomorrow they'd do it again. Chester moved like a creature who understood time, not its ticking, but its moods. He knew how to walk when the maple leaves fell in lazy spirals, how to stay still when summer took its breath between afternoon thunderclouds. He had learned the cadence of the valley, and the valley had, in turn, made space for him. In autumn, his golden coat matched the scattered leaves that dusted the gravel path. He walked with careful steps, nose low, not tracking, but listening ears twitching. At the sound of crows in far trees, or the rustle of deer beyond the fence, sometimes he'd stop, lift his head, and breathe so deeply that even the wind seemed to pause and listen back. In winter, tracks crisscrossed behind him, his own paw prints, weaving confidently through the snow, beside Ed's deeper boot marks. Frost clung to his whiskers. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the crunch of ice and the distant echo of wood splitting under Ed's axe. Chester would glance back often to make sure Ed was behind him, always checking. Spring woke him early. The light came fast then, soft and golden and full of returning sounds. He would sniff where the violets pushed up along the base of the porch, ears flitting with distant bird calls. Sometimes he'd tilt his head toward a sound and remain like that for minutes, as if deciphering a message passed in chirps and whistles. Ed and Marianne watched quietly through the rhythm of these seasons. They never spoke over the sacredness of Chester's rituals. They knew better. You don't interrupt a dog who's listening to something older than words. He grew more than familiar. He became essential. He seemed to understand their tones before, their words, their silences before they formed. If Marianne's breath hitched, Chester's paw was suddenly there, gentle on her knee. If Ed paced too long between orchard rows, Chester would appear behind him, tail swaying like a metronome set to a heart's tempo. Once, Marianne awoke early, pain blooming behind her eyes like a slow thunderstorm. Before she could stand, Chester was already beside her bednose, against her palm, steady and cool. Ed swore later that Chester had stirred from his sleep, nearly an hour before she'd made a sound. It wasn't only illness or routine that drew him. He knelt beside joy, too. When Ed lit the fire for the first frost each year, or when Marianne baked bread and the windows fogged with warmth, Chester would lie across the kitchen rug, belly stretched to the heat, tail thumping in blissful rhythm, talked to him like he was part of everything, because he was. When Marianne hummed, Chester's tail moved. When Ed read aloud by the hearth, Chester curled close, nose tucked against Ed's slippers. And when storms drew close, when thunder cracked its knuckles over the glen, Chester wouldn't hide. He would sit at the window, watching, as if counting the seconds between lightning and rain. Ed would say, "He's tracking it like cloudwork." Marianne said, "He's guarding us from the sky." As the years folded in on themselves, unchanged by date or calendar, Chester stayed constant. His fur grew paler, just slightly, his pace a little slower. But when morning came, when the air still carried shadows and the driveway glistened with dew, he rose, always ready, not only for the paper or the warmth of Marianne's chair, but for the fullness of morning, the rising rituals, the steady giving, and the soft expectation that someone was waiting. And through it all, he never lost that gaze, that deep golden stillness, that way of looking at a person and making them believe they were the only thing in the world that couldn't be replaced. Because to Chester, the world wasn't fields or trees or THUNDERCLOUDS. It was two voices, one cup passed hand to hand, that first light falling across a porch with someone waiting. The first day it didn't come, no one noticed. Not really, the kettles still win. Ed still touched the sleeve of the cardigan draped over the old ladderback chair, and Chester, still moving with the quiet certainty of habit, walked the 40 paces to the edge of the gravel drive, as though some small string tugged at his chest. But the box was empty. No roll of paper with its rubber band, just dew and a linger of yesterday's frost. Chester looked long enough for the wind to nudge the leaves beside his paws. Then he lowered his head and walked back up the drive, ears low, mouth empty. He pushed the kitchen door open as he'd always done, but when he paused before Marianne's chair, there was nothing to give. "Well now, isn't that strange?" Ed muttered, flipping the radio dial with more force than usual. "Must be running late today." But the words felt too loose, even as he said them. The next morning, Chester went out again. The box stood red and waiting against a silver dawn. But agate empty, he searched, muzzle dipping beneath the lip of the post. He paced once around the wooden base, then stood still for a long while. There was nothing to carry. That afternoon, Ed called the local distribution office. The boy who answered sounded apologetic but cheerful. "They're switching to digital now," he explained. "Out by the glens, not enough houses left getting paper. Company says it's greener. You can get the app pretty easy." Ed hung up slowly, thumb resting against the rotary's final turn. Marianne was quiet that night as she folded her quilt. At the end of the bed, her fingers trembled where they touched the edge of the stitching. "Maybe he'll forget," she said. Ed didn't answer. On the third morning, Chester went out as usual, waited longer than usual, then came back, this time with a stick of smooth, knotted thing that looked like it had spent weeks in the bend of the creek. He walked to her as if it were the paper, held it gently in his jaw, long enough for Marianne to reach. She blinked, took the stick with careful fingers. "Well," she said softly, "isn't that something?" The next day, it was a pinnacone, damp, mottled with bits of moss. The day after that, a solitary glove, torn at the wrist, with a child's name stitched along the inside. Tag. Chester placed each object as he would have placed the folded news, gently, with purpose, as if each item had meaning, even if they didn't know it yet. Ed sat back in his chair, watching them, Marianne and the dog. A ritual unspoken now, but still untouched. He doesn't know it stopped, he said one morning as chestnut smoke from the fireplace curled around the beam above his head. He just knows she's waiting. Some mornings, Marianne would smile and pretend to read from the pinnacone. Other days, she'd simply hold the glove in her lap, as if it might warm like the paper once did. The porch light changed with the season, more wind now, more brittle leaves scraping past the thresholds. But Chester's routine didn't falter. He still stepped off the porch before the sun cleared the ridge, still walked the same 40 paces, still returned always with something. It wasn't fetching anymore, not in the way people thought. It was remembering, carrying, completing a circuit. You could slow it down, change the shape of the offerings, but the meaning remained to Chester. The world still asked something of him each morning, and so he gave. The wind came sharper that year, like it had bones tucked behind it. Windows whispered all night long, loosening at their panes, and Ed found himself waking before the kettle, lying in their bed alone. Hands still stretched toward the space where Marianne once slept. She had fallen ill in October. Not a sudden collapse, but a slow fade, like the bloom drawn from a leaf, or the sound pulled from a song. The doctor came every third Thursday. The neighbors left casseroles and linen-wrapped loaves on the bench outside. But nothing changed. Chester followed her more closely now, not simply beside but beneath, resting against her slippers as she sat by the fire, wedging his head beneath her arm when she coughed. When she spoke, he tilted his head further than before, as if trying to hold every word until it settled. Somewhere in that great remembering space, only dogs seemed to have Dot. Ed didn't have to ask for help. Chester understood. He waited outside the bathroom when her balance grew uncertain, trotted ahead to press the light switch when dusk came faster than expected, sat squarely at the foot of the bed each time the fever returned, unmoving, watching. On the mornings, she could still sit in the kitchen. Chester brought something, sometimes a feather, sometimes a small stone, but always neatly placed into her hands, as if the shape of giving might help her stay, as if devotion could anchor the body where medicine could not. By mid-January, she no longer rose for tea. The cardigan went untouched on the back of her chair. Her paper treasures, the pine cones and sticks, the hollowed bit of driftwood made a shabby shrine on the mantel. And Chester stopped his journey to the box. Instead, he simply walked the hall. He laid outside her door, nose tucked beneath the jamb. When Ed entered the room with her tray, Chester followed like a shadow. On the morning of February 5th, the frost came drifting like talcum down the orchard rows. The trees slept under their pale blankets. The kettle didn't rattle with urgency. Ed lit the fire without song. When he crept into the bedroom, it felt too still. Marianne's eyes were shut, her chest unmoving, one hand laying open beside the quilt seam. Her breath had left so simply, it took him a long time to realize it was gone. Chester already knew he had risen from the foot of her bed, slow but sure, walked with precision, no hesitation, no pretense, and headed toward the door, tail low, ears slack. Ed didn't follow at first. He watched the dog's shape disappear past the edge of the threshold. Soft paws against wood outside. The morning was pale and bitter. Snow marked the porch steps. But Chester moved, nose raised to an invisible trail, past the flower beds, past. The rusted rake left, leaning against the porch rail, and down the drive. 40 paces he didn't pause at the box. Didn't search for paper or pine cone. He sat, straight-backed, watching the lane, The wind made no sound. Ed stood at the top of the steps. One hand caught against the splintered post, like it could hold him up. Tears blurred his eyes, but even through them, he could see Chester's shape, still, golden against the frost-gilt gravel. Eyes forward, waiting. And in that moment, Ed understood something he hadn't. Even in all his long years, devotion didn't vanish with the person. Sometimes it wore itself thinner. Sometimes it just moved to the edge of the world, looked out and kept watch, because it didn't know any other way to love. The valley softened in the weeks that followed. Winter's edge dulled into mudwash and melt. The trees, though bare, began to breathe with their own slow rhythm. And in the farmhouse, silence took up residence like dust in the corners, loud, never moving, just filling everything. One morning, before the sun had fully found the fields, Ed opened the kitchen cupboard with an old slowness. The mug clinked against the saucer. The lemon bomb had lost its sharpness, but he steeped it anyway. Chester rose as he always had, bone-slow breath deep as he stood to stretch. But something had changed in his gaiter-quiet drag in the back left paw. Ed noticed it. He said nothing. At the porch's edge, Chester paused. The wind stirred his ears, but he didn't look back. He stepped down one, then two. All the way to the gravel and followed the path his paws had printed 1,000 times before. The mailbox waited in its usual lean, red paint flaking like old bark. And there, placed carefully on the lip by Ed just moments earlier, sat a folded sheet of paper, blank, no print, no name, just something to carry. Chester picked it up, gently, not with urgency, but with dignity. He turned, walked back to the house and paused at the door. It opened slowly. Ed stood there, one hand on the frame. Neither man nor dog moved at first. Chester's eyes lifted, met Ed's, and something passed between them. Then he walked inside. The paper blank and silent was placed on the floor beside the empty chair. Not for praise, not for thanks, but because habits built from love don't break when one piece is missing. They reshape, they carry on, bearing new weight. That morning, Ed spoke almost to the air. She'd say, "Good boy," right about now. Chester stood beside the chair, said nothing, waited. Day after day, they did the same. The light changed longer, then softer. Sometimes golden, sometimes clouded. Sometimes Ed would leave bird feathers or pressed leaves in place of the paper, just to see what the dog would do. Always, Chester brought them back, no longer to her hands, but to the space where her hands had once been. Sometimes, Ed imagined them being caught chuckled over and tucked into her robe's pocket. The absence didn't ache any less, but at least it had shape. Now, the neighbors noticed first that the dog was still out there, same time each morning, sitting at the mouth of the drive like a ghost with a gentle heart. They'd wave, slow their cars. Some had never even known the woman's name, but they felt the pull of that ritual. Even without understanding, they respected it. Some left offerings of their own sticks bundled with twine. A child's drawing weighed with a stone. Once, someone left a page from an old book, folded into a paper crane. Chester carried it back like holy script. Spring kissed the orchard. Vines bloomed too early, shy and unsure in the face of lingering frost. Ed walked slower these days, leaning harder on the porch rail. Chester followed, still, but his steps echoed differently. The soft padding a little fainter, a little further between. Sometimes they'd sit on the porch together, just watching the drive, not talking. Ed's hand on Chester's back, the thrum beneath his fur still strong, but quieter. And some evenings, when the sun blushed over the western hills, Ed would murmur, "You think she notices?" Chester never answered, but he stayed. He always stayed, because the promise hadn't drifted away with fog or frost. It had simply changed hands. Where once the world had been ordered by 2 cups of tea and the softness of her voice, now it was the low hum of Ed's grief and the steady pause of a dog who understood that love, once given, doesn't vanish, it waits. The sun crept slow that spring, like it had grown shy of the house on the hill. Light slanted through the orchard in long, golden bars, warming the moss between stones. The frogs had returned to the creek bend, the kind that croaked like old drawers. Opening, and Ed would sit on the porch, one hand around a mug that no longer steamed, watching the earth stretch back into color. Chester had slowed with the thaw, not just in his gait, but in the way he lay down, as if the ground might bruise easier now. His breathing was heavier, measured, his eyes still clear, but softened at the corners, smudged with time. Some mornings Ed had to bend to help him with. The steps, just stubborn bones, he'd say softly, patting Chester's side. The old retriever would rise only after the second pat, shake his fur with a sigh, and set down the porch path. Still 40 steps to the drive, always 40, though they took longer now, and his paws dragged on the gravel just enough to leave small sweeping arcs behind each print. The paper still blank, sometimes crystal-weighted in its usual place. Ed placed it there like an offering, never late, never folded wrong. Chester would lift it slowly, jaws more careful now, and make his return. He no longer climbed the porch all at once. He paused at the 3rd step, rested, then the next 2. But still, each morning, the ritual held. No one told him to stop. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones when they passed the lane. A woman in a red coat left tulips tied in string by the mailbox. Children whispered stories at the school bus stopper about a dog who waited for ghosts, about a promise wrapped in fur. Then, one morning in late April, the sun rose in sudden gold, sharp and clear. A mockingbird sang where the chimney cracked. Ed started the kettle. The trees were budding green. Chester stood, stretched. His tail wagged once. He descended the steps 1, 2, 3 with the same soft rhythm at the halfway point of the drive. He paused. The wind caught the edge of the grass and ruffled his ears. He looked toward the road, but he didn't reach the box, just short of the end. Just past the last of his own footprints, he lay down quietly, not with collapse, not with pain, just rest. His head tucked toward his front paws, his breath shallow, but even as if the earth itself had asked him to listen. His eyes stayed open, watching the horizon. He made no sound. Ed didn't notice right away. The kettle sang, then stilled. The tea steeped. The sun climbed a little higher. When Ed opened the screen door, he expected footsteps, expected the low sound of shifting paws. Instead, there was only wind. He saw Chester then still, golden in the morning light, his shape curved with the peace of something complete. Ed walked slow, slower than he had in years, each footfall unsure if it would land on sorrow or something. Softer, he reached Chester's side, kneeling. He placed one hand against the dog's flank. No movement, just warmth, fading like the last curl of breath from a song. The morning not marked by bells, but by silence. Not grief as fire, but grief as hush for a long while. Ed didn't rise. He sat next to the old dog, hand resting against that place where heartbeat had once thrummed, his face unreadable. No sobs, no words, just the hush. Later, hours later, he folded the blank paper once, then twice, and placed it gently beneath Chester's paw. That day, there was nothing to return, nothing to give back. But somehow, the stillness said enough, because a promise fulfilled doesn't shout. It sighs and rests. The house stands quiet now, quiet in the way old things are when their purpose has faded but not disappeared. The porch has leaned further into the earth, and the windows blink under blankets of ivy, the orchard once groomed by Ed's steady hands grows wild at the edge, blossoms tangled with thorn. A rusted rake leans forgotten beside the side gate. The wind hums along the gutters. No one lives there anymore, not really, not in the way that fills teacups or folds cardigans onto chairs. But sleep comes easy to the house, and in its dreams there are still footfalls across the floorboards. A kettle, the soft clink of mugs, and a dog at the end of the drive. They say he was always there, sunrise or fog, snow too deep for boot sand, that he never missed a day. Some remember the woman with the kind eyes who used to wave from the window. Others remember the man who walked slower and spoke softer after she'd gone. But most remember the dog, a flash of gold and stillness, a gaze you couldn't quite meet without feeling like maybe you'd forgotten something important, maybe someone, maybe a promise long past. Kids who grew up here swear the house was haunted, but not in the frightening way. It was the kind of haunting that made you slow down near the turn in the road, the kind that tucked warmth into your chest without you realizing. Sometimes they'd see something, a shape at the end of the driveway, sitting, waiting, especially on mornings edged in fog or evenings when the moon swam silver over the hills. Not a bark, not a movement, just presence. A new family moved into the glen once, not into the old house, it wasn't safe, but into one further up the ridge. One morning, their daughter came back from the lane, cradling a single glove. Small, too small for her. The name stitched inside had belonged to no one they knew. They say a stick was found leaning beside the red mailbox, wrapped in wire like a charm. A pinnacone tucked into an old teacup on the porch rail. No one took credit. No one had been seen, but the gifts kept coming every year. When the dogwoods bloomed near Widow's Bridge and the creek thawed with the mountain melt, someone would leave a folded piece of paper by the box. Nothing written, just paper. Sometimes heavy with rain, sometimes crisp like it had never been touched, and always by next morning it would be gone. Neighbors tell the story now to visitors about a house with a soul too big for just people, about a dog who waited not for memory but for meaning. They tell it slow, softer than bedtime, as if saying it loud might break something that still lingers. They leave things without expectations, scraps of ribbon, feathers, pocketed stones, and when the wind carries them down the lane, they wonder if perhaps they've been accepted, not collected, just returned to something larger at dawn. When the mist curls like smoke across the fields, some stand very still by the fence line, and some say, if the timing is just right, you'll see the shape again, a glint of gold among the shadows, back straight, ears alert, not moving, only watching. You'll feel it before you see it. That soft insistence, like a hush around your ribs. The feeling that something has been promised on your behalf. That a loyalty not your own is still being honored, just in case you needed it. Some dogs fetch, but a rare few they never stop giving.